Senator David Lent, how are you, sir?
I'm great. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You and I got connected because, again, I've been doing a lot of conversations around education. You brought forth a perspective on education and a different route of starting to, get our feet wet with funding private schools with public dollars. And you also had some interesting ideas about the different regulations that we should. It's difficult to argue for people that we should put regulations on private entities, private schools. But in the absence of being able to put regulations there, if we are to set up a real serious market and a competition system, if we can't add regulations, perhaps we take away regulations from the public schools. And I had been talking to a couple of people about that last week, and then you brought it up. I didn't even know who you were. I was like, oh my gosh, this guy gets it. So I wanted to have you on, but you were also, before we started talking about preserving Idaho treasures like, redfish or other resort areas for Idahoans, because the state is, I don't want to use under attack, but it's being definitely flooded by out-of-state, tourists, which block out Idaho residents.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that's been going on the last couple of years is our state parks. We have a tremendous state park system, and other areas. I mentioned to you that the area around Spokane, folks up in North Idaho are really taking advantage of the resources that we have as a state up there. And it's getting to the point where you'd go to these campgrounds and they were all out-of-staters. And we talked a little bit, you and I did, about the federal funds and some of the stipulations there. But I really feel, and I think others do, that our state resources, first of all, we should make them available. It's our tax dollars that are paying for these, essentially. So we've come up with a couple ideas. One way is to maybe allow our residents to have a lead time when it comes to reserving some of these resources, like our campgrounds and different things. So we're working on that. That's one of the issues we're working on. I like the concept of trying to figure out what the problem is we're trying to solve. And school choice is a great example of how that works. I say, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Are we trying to enable lower-income parents to find the right fit for their kids who are economically not able to do that now? If that's the problem we're trying to solve and we're trying to be fair about it, then I think we could do something. And what we've tried to do, and I think it's important to know that I have not been a fan of public dollars going to private religious schools. I haven't. The reason is because I think you need some threshold of accountability associated with that. I've been to Arizona. I met with the speaker there, Toma, who was the champion of school choice in Arizona, Arizona's held up as the gold standard. We had a bill, 1038, a couple of years ago, Senator Nichols brought, that was basically mirrored what they're doing in Arizona. Representative Toma, I went to dinner with him, and he said, when you go about this, make sure you're very measured in your approach. And that very session is when we had a full-blown universal come through, and of course it didn't get through. But one thing that's important, I think, in this is to remember that school choice is really a symptom of a bigger problem we have with public education in general. I hear people say that, our government schools are failing and this and the narrative that goes out. In reality, Idaho schools rate at or above the national averages when it comes to academic on the national norm tests. So, and we're doing that at about 60 cents on the dollar of the national average spent on our students.
And Senator, if I may, I'm so happy you just pointed this out. I have been telling people this, and of course, everyone's like, well, I went to an Idaho public school and it wasn't great. It's like, okay, but we can all come with anecdotal pieces. But when compared to the larger body, we are consistently ranked, not just best bang for the buck, number one bang for the buck in the entire country, but the results are actually not bad. Like, you could do way worse than what we're doing with the dollars we have.
Yeah, especially considering the money that we're putting into it. Excuse me.
No, you're good. You're good. I know it's a working day. I appreciate you making the time.
I meant to do that before. So when you consider that we're only spending 60 cents on the dollar of the national average, we get a great value for our education in Idaho. So what we have to be careful about is the narrative that starts really driving a negative trajectory with public education. So let's take the case in point, which is school choice. School choice is really a symptom of a bigger issue, which is our public education system. I like to use a box as an example. That box was built over 100 years ago, and it served us well in this country. Free public education has been a pillar of our democracy and served us well. The challenge we have is in the last 30 years, and let me give you an example. how that box has come under even extreme pressure. I was working at a nuclear plant in the 1980s as a consultant. The first time I had a computer on my desk. Mm-hmm. In the 90s, we got the internet. In the 2000s, we got smartphones. And I was a training manager at a nuclear facility, and we literally saw people who had been using processes for years all of a sudden start having problems. And they say, it's broken, it doesn't work. What had changed was not the process, but the people. Our approach to how we analyze our work, how we interface with our environment actually changed. And so when you think about that, starting in about 2005, when smartphones really hit with social media, that's when we saw all these changes in our youth. We started seeing, and if you go into schools right now, you'll see one of the complaints is the behavior issues are out of control.
Yes.
And it wasn't always that way. So we have what's changed.
And again, to be clear, same kids, different environment. We have given different inputs.
So we had a box.
Yeah, right.
What has happened is your society and culture moves faster than the institution can evolve.
Right.
And we start looking back and saying, oh, the box is broken. Public school's broken. Well, what's changed is our students coming in have changed.
Yeah.
Our parents have changed. Our expectations have changed. And now we live in this, instead of the Industrial Revolution, we live in the knowledge revolution, which has changed. Almost every job you go to now is affected by technology. So we have so many changes. And so when I say it's a symptom of a bigger problem, we're really struggling in the public school system because we haven't evolved to make up the difference. So when I say things like we need to level the playing field, we need to go back and reset public education so that they can compete. This exodus we're seeing from public education is really because kids are coming home saying, do you know what happened in class today? The way kids are acting. Parents, or teachers, I talk to teachers and they say, I have been physically abused by students, and that would have never happened before. Kids are just getting more and more out of control. So we need to go back and reset public education so that we can compete with what's happening on the private side. It's not that those schools are better necessarily. It's that we've kind of lost sight of, I guess the way to go back and say is we're living still with our box, and perhaps what we need is a round ball that's more flexible today.
That's an interesting concept. So you feel that there's a degree of, like, one of the largest driving forces in favor of school choice is that we have behavioral issues within schools. And it's not necessarily the academic performance of said schools, but the culture and behavior issues that are percolating and, obviously congregating within these public campuses.
Yeah. So what happens, you'll see that kind of the hard things of society, the things that necessarily we don't like, especially if you're from a conservative nature, they tend to surface in the public arena, in your schools, in your parks.
Sure.
That's where it kind of comes up. And so we have teachers, great teachers in our public schools today that are really suffering because they're dealing with this at the same time they feel like they're handcuffed because of the way the laws have evolved and parental rights in a way that takes it away from the school. So an interesting thought here is, a child has a right to be normalized in education if they have, for whatever reason, they're disabled and something mentally incapacitated, nonverbal. Our culture now tries to mainstream them. But at the same time, you have kids who now come to school, they're sitting in a class. Do they have rights to a non-disruptive learning environment? And that's really where this conflict is coming in. We have to go back and rebalance that. And I think that's what we need to do. I'm convinced that Idaho can be the leader in the nation of this. The timing is right. The COVID, we went through all this change.
Yeah.
We've had this incremental, we've been trying to address this. COVID accelerated that change. It accelerated where we're at today. And you read these surveys and they say like a high percentage of people are in favor of school choice. Absolutely. They feel like students should be able to go where they can thrive. Where the rub comes in is, are we spending public tax dollars to support a closed door education system?
And this was actually going to be my question. You're kind of hitting on it, which is, hey, look, the public schools have to take everyone. And that system of you're not a walled garden. Whoever shows up, whatever behavioral issues, whatever in the absence of like really extreme, they will have to take you. If we changed that for the public schools, and I'm not advocating for or against that, but if we changed that, you would not see the same kind of problems. One of the big benefits that you get out of, say, a charter school or a private school or any kind of thing of that nature is they can remove students that are being disruptive. And so again, if the problem is, hey, we don't like the behavioral problems, then that's a problem with the system, right? Like we don't necessarily need to defund, like let's say Eagle High School. Let's say there are 50 kids that are causing behavioral issues. We don't need to necessarily strip Eagle High School of funding as much as we need to liberate, theoretically, we would just liberate their capacity to remove those problem students, right? It was like that movie, not Stand and Deliver. What was the other one where he like cleaned up the LA school system? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I know what
you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But like, that's the point. It's like, look, if you know who the problem is, you can get rid of it. That's the only thing that the private schools have on the public schools, that they can stop people from matriculating. They're like, no, you're out, right? It's not, I have not seen a private school system. I'd love to see it, not as like a challenge, but like, I love education. I think education is great. I ran a private, SAT tutoring company. I thought I was the best educator. I had these stats to back it up. I don't see this like grossly superior private education system that's floating around. What I do see is an education system in the private sector that can select its students. And that produces a different result. It's not that they're necessarily better at educating kids. It's just that they can kick people out or not accept people.
We have to be careful that we don't sell this as the golden ticket. The answer is I'm going to send my kid to a private religious school and then all my problems will be over.
Right.
When in reality, when you take your student there, you have less actually rights than you do in the public system. And you'll find that out in a hurry when they can come and say, I'm sorry, but your child is not a fit in our school and you need to go somewhere else. What we've tried to do in this approach in our legislation is kind of come at it from a common sense point of view. We know that learning requires a level of accountability. That's built into the process. And so if you think of this as like a charter school light, we tried to have a light touch with these institutions, but still provide a way for them to participate. Totally voluntary. They don't have to. But if they would like to utilize public dollars in their approach, then there is a level, there's a threshold that they need to consider. A point I'd like to make is that we have had this great experiment we call charter schools. Charter schools are thriving in Idaho. Why are they thriving and the regular public schools are not?
Well, again, they take applications and they can boot kids out, right?
And they're a regular public school. They have so many things going for them. So right now, it's interesting. If you read the Constitution, you alluded to this a little bit. That was interesting what you said. It's said when it talks about education, it says it is the duty of the legislature to establish and maintain a system of schools. So if that's the case, the discussions that we're having kind of now that are starting to grow and get traction is perhaps it's the legislature that should really stand up and lead out in this resetting of public education. We are in a position and we have responsibility by the Constitution to lead out. And so there's a couple of initiatives I think you'll hear about, and I'd be glad to come back and tell you more about as they start to develop this spring. But I'd like to see our legislators go to their town halls and say, we're here to talk about education, and we're going to do it by having these school discussions at the grassroots level. We want our PTAs, we want our school boards, we want our Chamber of Commerce to be having discussions about what do we need to do in our education system in Idaho to make it better. And then if we roll that back up from the bottom and we're engaging them and they're part of this change, we start to build back that ownership and pride that comes in our local public education system. I think that's got some real traction, some possibilities. So I hope you'll hear more about that as we continue.
Yeah, I listen, first off, I'd love to have you back anytime to talk about the initiatives as they roll out. One thing that is becoming readily apparent is that when people talk about problems in the school system, and I think whatever the problem is, you're right. Okay. Like I had a parent get a hold of me and say, hey, I had this theater teacher who, in the school district that's close by, I had this theater teacher who, approved this ridiculous play. And here my daughter's grandparents came to see it and they, all of this stuff. They were really unhappy about some of the things and I was like, well, I wouldn't like that one either. And she was upset about the fact that she felt the theater teacher was pushing this kind of like cultural thing on people and really being aggressive with it. And I was like, okay, you're right. You get to be upset, like 100%. There's no way that I'm going to disagree with you on that. This has been your experience. But I think the problem that I'm seeing over and over in these conversations is people are failing to articulate the thing they're most upset about. I think a lot of people see things that are upsetting online. I think and there are plenty of things that people can be upset about, like this, theater teacher. You can be upset about that 100%. But how do we resolve that? Are we imagining that if we go to a private-based system that all of the problems would disappear? And as you're pointing out, it's like, hey, you're going to lose a lot of rights. You're dealing with a private business now. They can boot you out. They can, do whatever they want. You don't have rights. You don't have rights to, representation from the state. You don't have access to resources like you would in the public school. But can we just all get on the same page with the problem? I thought Representative Hill, with the bill he brought forward to ban any flags outside of the Idaho flag or the United States flag. I'm like, there you go. If this is the problem for somebody, this should resolve it. Like, for the people that think there's a culture war, that culture wars within the public sphere, as you're kind of pointing out, things that percolate in public areas. If you think this is the number one thing, then why don't you get 100? Like, if you don't want flags, if you don't want questions in bathroom, and you want books resolved, and those are your primary issues, let's figure out a way to address those issues on a community-based level or state-based level that resolves those issues for people. If you think it's academics, let's resolve that. But let's just articulate the problem, and then you can start figuring out how to work around, or, figure the workarounds, right? But nobody's doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have the structure in place. Without growing government, we have elected school boards at the local level. And I think the answer here is to go back and really empower and lean more on more control, local control. Let them figure out what works best for them. If you have an issue, rather than have the state trying to decide all the time what's best for you, let's let this interesting concept with the Trump administration about flattening out the Department of Education at the federal level and passing that through. I had the opportunity to go to Finland and look at their education system, and I was surprised that they funnel the money in, but it's controlled locally, and so they have that accountability locally. They deal with their problems locally. The example you used about that should be resolved at the local level,
right?
And
they in fact did set up a committee. Yeah. After this problem to figure out, and who was on the committee is up to them, but they set up a committee to approve the plays and the whole thing. So it's like, listen, and then if you don't like the people on the committee, that's a thing. But at the very least, they did reach out to the community and say, hey, we would like people to approve or disapprove these plays. And if you still don't approve of them, that's fine. But they are trying to give local control to the community.
Oh, I agree. And I think that's where it's going to have to go. If we're going to build trust back in our local public schools, we have to trust our folks in our communities, give them ownership, responsibility, and let the schools be accountable to them.
You mentioned last week, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned at least some degree of, look, we should reduce the restrictions and regulations if we're going to go down this road, we should at least consider reducing the regulations on a state level. Yes, adhere to the federal regulations, but maybe the answer is taking away state control. Because if we're giving money to private entities, we could, with very little or no control, whatever it might be, there are a lot of versions of these bills. But if we're going to do that, we should look at doing that and liberating the public school from the same burdens that we're offering private.
Absolutely. And
help me understand that.
Here's an example. I asked the State Department, Superintendent Critchfield, I said, help me understand what's happening as far as that reporting. This is part of this process that we're going through. And they gave me a report. I counted up 35 federal reports and over 50 additional state reports that's coming in. And when you think about that from an organizational management point of view, what happens is your leadership team or your administrative team becomes more heavily weighted on the management side of education, because we've defined success in education basically as checking the boxes. That's easy for us to do, right? We give standardized tests. We check a box. How well are we testing them on their problem solving and deeper level skills? Not really. But because it's easier, we've developed the system that way. So if you think about that, the educational leadership side of the equation is really where you get this innovation and this, the start where you really think about what's going on. Again, referring back to Finland, the their kids are not in school that long during the day. They insist that they have, outside of school activities.
Sure.
And they compared themselves to the Asian students who, spend 10, 12 hours a day, and their testing is, very similar. So it's really about culture. It's about how we approach the learning situation that makes a difference, in my perspective. I'm convinced that we can do this, but I'm also convinced that the time is right. Right now, this next year or two is a time when we have an opportunity in our state to really reinvent this process. And I'm convinced if we go to the people of Idaho and say, be part of this process, help us understand what you need from your public education system. And then we as policymakers analyze that data, put it together. I would love to see us have maybe 5 districts in the state come forward and say, we're interested in being your pilot. And the state would say, we're going to give you money, and we're going to give you 3 years and kind of let you have some free rein here, because we want to accelerate the process that we were trying to do with charters originally, right? The whole purpose of charters originally was to improve the system.
Right.
Well, we kind of missed that boat. The charters are doing fine. Let's go back now and focus on how can we accelerate that process for our public system and leverage that in. I'm convinced that this is the state. We have the Superintendent Critchfield, our governor. We have people who are willing to shake their heads and say, let's go for this.
Right. And I'm very impressed with the charter system in the state of Idaho. And I would love to hear this too. What is it people want? Do you want better academics? Do you want a more cultural neutral area? For instance, West Ada is a neutral campus. You can't have, like political flags up in classrooms. You can't have, any flag besides the United States and Idaho flag. Their bathrooms are just, hey, male and female. Like, you have really a very neutral atmosphere that people criticize. Some people criticize. A lot of people enjoy it. But look, let's just define what we want, right? As you're saying, if we took the information and people said, hey, we want A, B, and C, it's like, okay, is the public school capable of delivering A, B, and C? And if it is, I love the idea of having pilot districts where it's like, all right, look, guys, they want A, B, and C. You guys have 3 years to give us A, B, and C. Yep. We need a quantifiable metric. We need to understand how you're doing it. And again, we're going to give you free rein. Just have at it.
Clear the table off and go after it. And that's really how we'll accelerate this evolution of our education system. That's what we need to do to save public education, I'm convinced.
I love that. One thing, and again, I know you took time out, carved it out today. Can we go back to the original issue of trying to get Idaho residents priority on GEMS within Idaho? Because again, we chatted about it briefly, and then we got so quickly into choice. The issue is ultimately that we have some areas that do receive some federal money. So we can't just say, hey, nobody but Idahoans get to go here, because it's like, all right, well, if we're taking public dollars, then it should be available to the public. But we do have instances where people are using either varying degrees of technology, or just there's such a glut of individuals from out of state that are trying to get into some area because Idaho constantly is being discovered. What do we do with that? How do we work with these problems to ensure that, hey, if you live, 10 miles away from a resort, or if your family's been going to this resort for the last 20 years, and now you can't get a reservation to save your life, we're trying to help you. Like, how do we do that for people?
Well, you might be aware that we did introduce a new system this year, a new park reservation system.
I guarantee my wife knows it. I do not, but she does.
We have a brand new system. Yeah. And so we've been working on this for the last couple of years. And Senator Cook and myself have a meeting, I think it's this week, with Director Buxton to kind of evaluate where we're at. Let's look at it a little deeper. But we feel strongly that our Idaho residents need to benefit from our Idaho tax-supported facilities. We have such a great state, and people move here. I mean, that's wonderful to have people move here and enjoy these things. We love them, but let's protect them.
Gotcha. And Director Buxton is the Director of Parks and Rec for the state?
She is.
Man, I'll have to get Director Buxton on.
She's good.
It's everywhere I go here outdoor, especially in the summer and spring and fall, it's so fantastic. It's so well cared for. It's fantastic. It's unparalleled in my mind. And whatever we can do to preserve that, and especially at least try to give some preference to people who live here, that, it's part of their history. And look, I just got here, but I love it too. And this is my home now. So, I like that my boys will be able to grow up with it too.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it is. Senator, thank you for coming in today. I appreciate you. I really like the evolving conversation around education. I really like as well that your perspective is not, hey, the public school is irredeemable, that it has no place moving forward, that, it's, all these things. It's like, no, no, no. It worked. It worked really well. But the world has changed. What the kids walk in with in their pockets with their cell phones and everything, that has changed. What parents come to expect from the education system is changing. And the education system nationally has also changed a little bit as well. Like our culture has changed and we find ourselves at a mismatch. Mm-hmm. But let's figure out what we can do to get back to having this gold standard of education that's available to the public. And yeah, one interesting piece about Finland, I don't think they have private schools. I think that's one of the secrets of the Finland education system.
I did ask, and they do have some, but it's interesting that people really, they like their public system.
Right.
And so they do have some. I did ask that question when I was there specifically.
I read an article 10 years ago. They're like, oh, that's not a big emphasis. So they do have a couple. It's just not as.
Yeah, it's just not it's not a big thing there. But most people go into and they have such an interesting approach to education. Their first 8 years is more, let's just focus on functional literacy. And then they let them, we all grew up with the idea that in Europe, they track you and you take these tests and stuff. Their approach is everywhere you go in Finland when you talk education. We went to their elementary, their middle, their high schools, their colleges, and we went to their education facilities where they train their teachers. Everywhere at the top of the page it said, Finland education, no dead ends. And so they really let kids self-direct. They spend a lot of time helping them figure out what their likes and dislikes are. And then they kind of self-direct into their high school years and focus more there. We, of course, have built a system that every kid's going to go to college, and so we have basically a college prep. You need how many hours and how many years of math and English, and
that's a terrible direction.
So that's part of this whole thing that we need to reset. We need to step back and say, what does our business and industry folks need? Let's get them at the table, because right now 2/3 of our population doesn't graduate from college, but yet we're putting them out into this world that's changed with technology. We could do better. We can do better. Now's the time to do it.
God bless you, sir. Thank you for coming in. Please come in again as the session rolls out so we can talk about some more of these initiatives. I really appreciate what you're doing for Idaho.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.